There has long been a mistaken belief that during the Middle Ages, studies of human anatomy and dissection were prohibited by the Catholic Church. This belief often supports what is known as the conflict thesis, which argues that religion, specifically the medieval Catholic Church, opposed science and therefore hindered human progress. But the idea that Europeans stopped being interested in anything other than God for hundreds of years is, as we shall see, a load of bloody nonsense. Historians of the 1700s and 1800s claimed the Dark Ages was a period filled with illiterate barbarians. This view rather conveniently suited the ideas of the 18th and 19th centuries, which were focused on liberalism, colonialism, the scientific method, and plenty of lingering anti-Catholic sentiment. The Dark Ages is usually said to run from the fall of the Roman Empire to some point in the Middle Ages. Some believe this dark period lasted as late as the 1400s with the start of the Renaissance. And during this period, it was alleged by certain politically motivated thinkers that any interest in the human body after death was completely absent. However, evidence shows that Innocent III, who was Pope from 1198 to 1216, gave permission to undertake the first recorded autopsies since ancient times. This was the birth of the science of dissection. These early forensic and legal activities can be seen as the direct ancestors of modern autopsies. Up until that point, they were relying heavily on very ancient knowledge. In the 2nd century, Galen of Pergamon, a Greek working in the Roman Empire, became a doctor for gladiators. His observations of their wounds, along with animal dissections, formed the basis of medical knowledge in Islamic and European societies for many centuries. Galen's anatomical texts were basically unchallenged until the Renaissance, when public human dissections became popular. However, medieval European doctors were more active than often assumed, as shown by a new examination of the oldest known preserved human dissection in Europe. The rather grim specimen, now in a private collection, includes a human head and shoulders with the top of the skull and brain removed. The arteries were filled with a red metal wax compound, aiding in preservation, and the face now shows marks from rodent bites and insect larvae trails. The preparation was remarkably sophisticated. Philip Charlier, head of the study, said, "It's state of the art. I suppose that the preparator did not do this just one time, but several times, to be so good at this." Radiocarbon dating indicates the body is from between AD 1200 and AD 1280. So what was going on in the 13th century and the so-called Dark Ages that made them so skilled at performing autopsies? We have on record a couple of quite interesting accounts related to this flourishing of anatomical interest. The first tale involves a chaplain from the monastery Sancta Trinitatis of Malo-Leone near Bordeaux. This chaplain, to quote, "having surprised a criminal in the act of stealing religious articles from the abbey chapel, struck the would-be felon with a heavy farm implement. The thief fled despite his wounds, but was finally overtaken by parishioners who dispatched him with swords and clubs. The chaplain, fearing that the blow he had struck might have caused the death of the culprit, even if the additional injuries had not been inflicted, related his story to the abbot." The second tells of a bishop at Sigüenza near Toledo. This bishop, to quote once more, disturbed by the rowdy behaviour of a number of his parishioners during Mass, ordered his canons to restore order about the altar. As their efforts proved to be insufficient to control the throng, he seized a cane and began to drive back the crowd by prodding some persons and lightly striking others. The canons joined into this turbulent activity, and during the resulting melee, a young man was struck on the head. The young man seemed unaffected by the blow at first. He continued to eat, drink, visit public baths, and perform his undoubtedly arduous field labour. However, something was clearly wrong with his noggin. A month later, he was advised to submit to an operation upon his injured head, and the victim allowed an old, unskilled physician to cut into both his skull and the flesh of his head. 4 days after this operation, the young man died, and though 4 physicians testified that the surgical procedure was ineptly performed, thus causing the youth's death, common talk charged the bishop with having fatally injured the young man with a blow from his cane. Both stories come from Registorum Civ Epistolarum, a decretal of Pope Innocent III in 1209. Decretals were judgments on various ecclesiastical issues, including theology and canon law. These cases of death involving clergy were submitted to the papacy for judgment and included testimony from investigating physicians and surgeons. In the case of the chaplain chasing the thief, the issue was to determine the chaplain's guilt under canon law. This law states that when several people are involved in a brawl resulting in death, the person who delivers the fatal blow is guilty of homicide. Innocent III sought the expertise of physicians and after reviewing their autopsy report, declared that the chaplain had not delivered the fatal blow. The Bishop of Siguenza was under public suspicion regarding the death of a young man, a suspicion that threatened his position. As you might imagine, a bishop battering a young fellow to death with a big stick in his own church was not a good look. He turned to the papacy for help. Innocent III once again called for the testimony of surgeons and physicians. After examining their evidence, the pontiff concluded that the young man's death was due to the poorly performed surgery, not the bishop's thrashing. It seems Innocent III was a man of rationale who wanted to use scientific study to pursue a just course of action in his judgments. Scientific progress flourished in the later Middle Ages, particularly from the 13th century onward. Although many cultures, from ancient Greeks and Romans to early Europeans, restricted the dissection of human corpses, forcing figures like Galen to study animals and gladiators' wounds, there was no universal church prohibition on autopsies during the Middle Ages. In fact, the church sometimes ordered autopsies itself. These were often to search for signs of sanctity in the bodies of supposed saints. One notable example of these holy autopsies occurred in the year 1308. Nuns conducted a dissection of Chiara of Montefalco, an Umbrian abbess later canonized in 1881. They claimed to find a tiny crucifix in her heart and 3 gallstones in her gallbladder, which they interpreted as symbols of the Holy Trinity. The Italian peninsula, particularly Bologna in the 13th century, became a hotbed of medieval medical innovation and learning. For much of the early and high Middle Ages, Galen's work sufficed for medical theory in Western Europe. However, exposure to Islamic medical texts and scientific methods led to a thrilling expansion of medical practices in Bologna. Following the decretals of Innocent III, autopsies began to be used as vital tools in legal investigations. Bologna, along with its neighboring regions, became the center of dissection practices and early autopsy techniques. In the 1280s at Cremona, a physician conducted dissections on chickens and a human to uncover the cause of a rapidly spreading disease that left internal blisters and abscesses on humans and animals. Other records show us that human autopsies were performed during anatomy courses at the University of Bologna as early as 1260. So what were the autopsies actually like? Autopsies typically occurred in universities or special medical instruction spaces, often resembling amphitheaters to allow students to observe. This was, of course, not something just any old person could do. Special authorization was required. The bodies used were usually those of executed criminals, placed on large wooden tables. The tools included basic knives, saws, and hooks, which were naturally quite primitive compared to today's instruments. The process started with an external examination to note visible signs of disease or injury. Dissection followed a specific sequence, beginning with the abdominal cavity and then moving to the chest to examine the heart and lungs. Next, observations about the size, shape, and condition of these organs were often made. The final step was dissecting the head, which involved opening the skull to study the brain. This step was done carefully due to the complexity and fragility of brain tissue. Throughout the procedure, a master anatomist would explain the findings to students, probably relating them to the medical theories of the time. Sketches or written descriptions documented the findings for future reference. The lack of refrigeration meant bodies decomposed quickly, limiting the time available for thorough examination. This necessity led to the development of preservation techniques, such as those seen in the recently discovered head. While autopsies became common in continental Europe, including France and Iberia, as well as Italy, they were rare in England. This scarcity was not due to concerns about the body's sanctity. Instead, it might have come from differing attitudes toward the recently deceased. In Italy, the soul was believed to leave the body quickly, whereas in Northern Europe, it was thought to depart slowly and to align with the corpse's gradual decomposition. Dissecting or performing an autopsy would disrupt this gradual process, some English believed. Back in Bologna in 1289 and 1295, the judiciary ordered legal examinations of corpses, including the case of Banciven, who was exhumed and found by surgeons to have died from 2 wounds. Another significant event in Bologna was the first documented medico-judicial dissection in the West, which took place in February 1302. Azzolino Deli had collapsed and died after a meal, his body swelling and discoloring rapidly. Suspecting poison from his enemies, Azzolino's family called for an autopsy. A judge appointed 2 physicians and 3 surgeons to investigate. Their internal examination found no signs of foul play, although their methods were limited to trying to detect telltale smells or discolorations of organs. This is considered the first recorded instance of forensic medical expertise in legal history. From this moment, the historical records are filled with dissections. A remarkable passage from the Cronaca Persicetana introduces us to Alessandra Giuliani, assistant to the renowned Bolognese anatomist Mondino in 1316. Here's what it says. She became most valuable to Mondino because she would cleanse most skillfully the smallest vein, the arteries, all ramifications of the vessels, without lacerating or dividing them, and to prepare them for demonstration, she would fill them with various colored liquids, which, after having been driven into the vessels, would harden without destroying the vessels. Again, she would paint these same vessels to their minute branches so perfectly and color them so naturally that, added to the wonderful explanations and teachings of the master, they brought him great fame and credit. This passage is really rather fascinating. It not only completely changes our understanding of the beginning of dissection, but also shows that women were far more involved in the cutting edge, so to speak, of anatomical investigation during this time. One might argue that the diminished role of women was another invention of 18th century liberalism. In any case, the high medieval period is far different from what we have been led to believe. The belief that the Church disapproved of autopsies may partly stem from a misunderstanding of a 1299 papal edict. This decree forbade the boiling of crusaders' bones for transport back home, insisting instead that the soldiers be buried where they died. But this was a specific rather than general edict that probably had some political or propaganda motives lurking behind it. Although there was more bodily investigation in the Middle Ages than often acknowledged, the 1200s remain the Dark Ages in terms of knowledge about human dissections. When Charlier and his team first examined the head and shoulders specimen, they assumed it was from the 1400s or 1500s. "We did not think it was so antique," Charlier admitted. However, radiocarbon dating placed the specimen firmly in the 1200s, which was truly surprising. Charlier noted that the veins and arteries were filled with a blend of beeswax, lime, and cinnabar mercury. Thanks to the cinnabar mercury, this mixture preserved the body and colored the circulatory system red. This indicates that the body was not merely dissected and discarded, but preserved, possibly for ongoing medical education. The man's identity remains unknown. He could have been a prisoner, an institutionalized individual, or a pauper whose body was never claimed. That is, until recently, when he rose from the dead to become one of the most curious and fascinating faces from the Dark Ages, which were not as dark as some would have us believe. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Death Channel. See you on the other side.